Before the story begins, allow your heart to grow quiet and let yourself move at a slower pace than the world around you. There are nights in life that are not meant for striving or escaping, but for learning how to wait in silence. There are seasons when it feels as though God is not speaking, yet even in that stillness, He is gently at work, patiently arranging details that human eyes cannot see. This story is not about loud miracles or victories that arrive in an instant, but about a man who was forgotten in the darkness of a prison, yet never forgotten in the plan of God. It is the story of Joseph, a man who once dreamed, who once believed in a divine promise, and who had to learn how to wait for a very long time when every door seemed closed. If you are tired tonight, if you feel trapped in a season of darkness of your own, stay here a little longer and listen slowly, because sometimes what we need most is not an immediate answer, but the peace to keep trusting. Before the dawn breaks, faith is often tested in the long night, and it is in those quiet hours that the human heart learns to rest fully in the hands of God. And now, the story of Joseph's final night in the prison will begin to unfold, as a gentle reminder that no darkness is deep enough to stop the plan of God from moving forward.
The night inside the Egyptian prison was unlike any other night Joseph had ever known. There was no sky to look up to, no stars to count, no wind to remind a man that the world outside was still moving forward. The darkness here felt dense, as though it could be touched, as though it pressed against the skin, seeped into the breath, and lingered deep within the soul. Joseph leaned against the cold stone wall, his hands bound by chains long familiar to his body, yet his mind had never learned how to be still. Years had passed, but memory did not fade. It simply waited, quietly, for a moment of weakness to rise again. He remembered clearly the first days after being brought into the prison. The fear had passed more quickly than he expected. What followed was shock, then the deep wound of betrayal, and finally a long, stretching silence. It was not silence because emotion was gone, but because emotion had been worn thin by years of waiting. Joseph had prayed, questioned, and struggled to understand why his path had turned so sharply into darkness. Yet the more he asked, the more he realized that some questions are not answered immediately, and some promises of God can only be understood when seen from a great distance. Tonight, that silence felt different. It was not the silence of despair, but something unfamiliar, as though everything had paused before an unseen turning point. Joseph could not name the feeling, yet his heart recognized it. It was the same quiet stirring he had felt as a boy when dreams first came to him in the night. Back then, he was young and unaware that a dream from God does not always lead along an easy road. He remembered the fields of his home, the sunlight falling upon the sheaves of grain, and the dream in which the sheaves of his brothers bowed before his own. He remembered another dream where the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to him. He had spoken of these dreams with innocent openness, not knowing that some revelations from God are not meant to be spoken too soon, and some visions must mature in silence. That youthful lack of restraint became part of the path that led him away from his father's house, beginning with the many-colored robe torn from his shoulders and ending in this place of confinement. The prison did not only restrain the body, it tested the soul. Over the years, Joseph had watched men arrive and depart, hopes rise and collapse. Some entered with fierce resistance, shouting and cursing, only to fall into quiet resignation when they realized the stone walls would not yield. Others clung to fragile hope, believing their name would be called, that justice would come swiftly, until hope itself turned bitter when the days passed unchanged. Joseph had seen it all, and it was this that led him to choose a different way, the way of remaining in the presence of God, even when he could not understand what God was doing. He remembered clearly the two prisoners who entered his life during those years, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker. They carried heavy dreams, and on an ordinary morning like any other, Joseph noticed their troubled faces. It was then he spoke words that would later prove to be a turning point, though he did not yet know it. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" That statement was not only for them, it was a confession of his own faith, that whether in palace or prison, God remained sovereign.
Joseph interpreted their dreams truthfully, holding nothing back, neither softening the warning nor exaggerating the hope. When he told the cupbearer that he would be restored to his position, Joseph made a simple, human request: "Remember me when it goes well with you." It was not a lack of faith, but the honest voice of a man who had suffered injustice for too long and longed for even a small door to open. Yet that door did not open. The cupbearer was restored, and Joseph was forgotten for 2 more long years. Those 2 years are scarcely described in Scripture, yet the silence itself speaks volumes. They were years in which Joseph learned not to anchor his hope in people, even those he had helped, but entirely in God. Each day in the prison became a lesson in faithfulness, not faithfulness when circumstances are favorable, but faithfulness when no sign of change appears. Joseph continued to work, continued to serve, continued to walk uprightly, as though he believed that God saw every small act, even when no one else did.
Tonight, as Joseph sat in the darkness, these memories moved slowly through his mind like a quiet river. He no longer accused, no longer demanded explanations. In their place was a strange peace, not born from circumstance, but forged through years of tested faith. He did not know this was his final night in prison, yet deep within he sensed that his waiting had not been in vain. God had never forgotten him, and if he had allowed Joseph to remain here until this moment, there was surely a purpose beyond human understanding. Joseph closed his eyes, his breathing steady, and in the darkness he entrusted himself to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The night was still long, but his heart was at rest. He did not know that when morning came, a sudden call would change everything and turn his life in a direction he could never have imagined. That story would come later. For now, in this night of waiting, Joseph learned the most important truth of all, that before God lifts a person to a place of honor, he often teaches them how to stand firm in the darkness without losing faith. As the hours passed, the prison remained unchanged, yet something within Joseph continued to deepen. Time in confinement had taught him that waiting is not merely the absence of action, but a quiet shaping of the heart. In the early years, he had counted days and measured hope by passing events, by footsteps in the corridor, by rumors of favor or judgment beyond the walls. But those habits had slowly fallen away. Waiting, he learned, was not about watching the door, but about allowing God to work unseen, even when nothing outward suggested progress.
Joseph understood now that the hardest part of waiting was not the length of time, but the uncertainty of purpose. If he had known how long he would remain in prison, or why this place was necessary, endurance might have been easier. Yet God had given him neither timetable nor explanation. Instead, he gave Joseph something more difficult and more valuable: the choice to trust without clarity. Faith, Joseph discovered, is not sustained by understanding the path, but by knowing the one who walks it. In the stillness of the night, Joseph reflected on how different his understanding of strength had become. As a youth, strength had meant prominence, recognition, and fulfillment of promise. He had imagined leadership as elevation above others, authority that would be visible and undeniable. But the prison had reshaped that vision. Strength, he now believed, was the ability to remain faithful when stripped of visibility, to serve when no reward was guaranteed, and to obey God when obedience led not upward, but deeper into obscurity. The years had taught him restraint. He no longer rushed ahead of God with his words or his expectations. He had learned that silence can be an act of faith, and patience a form of worship. In the prison, Joseph had no control over outcomes, but he had learned to govern his spirit. This inner discipline, forged in isolation, would later matter more than any skill or wisdom he possessed.
Joseph also came to see that God's favor had never truly left him, even when circumstances seemed to deny it. Scripture would one day say that the Lord was with Joseph in the prison, but Joseph had lived that truth long before it was written. He had felt it, not in freedom, but in grace to endure, in clarity of mind, in the quiet ability to bring order and compassion into a place designed for despair. God's presence did not remove him from suffering, but it preserved him within it. He thought again of his father, Jacob, and wondered whether he still lived, whether his grief had softened or deepened with time. Joseph had once longed for vindication before his family, for the chance to prove that the dreams were not arrogance, but revelation. Yet now that longing had been transformed. What he desired most was not to be proven right, but to be found faithful. If God chose to fulfill the dreams, Joseph would receive them with humility. If God chose a different path, Joseph trusted that obedience itself was not wasted. The prison had become a place of formation rather than punishment. Though Joseph did not choose it, he did not despise it. He sensed that God was preparing him for something that could not be entrusted to an untested heart. Leadership, Joseph now understood, is dangerous without suffering, authority unstable without humility, and power destructive without compassion. The darkness had not been meaningless, it had been instructional. As the night moved toward its unseen midpoint, Joseph's thoughts slowed. Reflection gave way to rest. He did not fight sleep as he once had, fearing lost time or missed opportunity. Rest itself had become an expression of trust. To sleep in prison was to declare that God neither slumbered nor slept, and that Joseph's future did not depend on his own vigilance. Unaware of the approaching dawn, Joseph allowed his body to settle and his mind to quiet. He did not know that this particular night marked the end of a long chapter of preparation. He only knew that he had done all he could do. He had remained faithful in small things, honest in his service, and steady in his trust. Whatever came next belonged to God. The prison walls stood unmoved, and the chains lay silent, but the true work of transformation had already been accomplished within. Joseph had become a man capable of carrying responsibility without pride and authority without cruelty. The waiting had shaped him into someone ready to be lifted, not because he sought elevation, but because he no longer required it to be whole. And so the night continued, heavy and quiet, holding within it the final moments of obscurity for a man whose life was about to change forever. But that turning point would not come until morning. For now, Joseph rested in the darkness, unaware that the silence itself was about to break. The night drew on, measured not by hours, but by the slow rhythm of breathing and the weight of stillness. Joseph slept lightly, not because his body was uneasy, but because years of confinement had trained him to rest without surrendering awareness. Even in sleep, his spirit remained settled, anchored in a trust that no longer needed reassurance. This was not the restless sleep of fear, but the quiet rest of a man who had learned that his life was held by God, not by circumstance. In the deepest part of the night, nothing outward changed. No footsteps echoed in the corridor. No voices broke the silence. The prison remained exactly as it had been the day before, and the day before that. Yet unseen and unannounced, the season of preparation was reaching its end. What Joseph did not know was that beyond these walls, the God who governs dreams was already stirring events into motion, aligning hearts and moments with precise intention. Joseph's waiting had accomplished its purpose. The boy who once spoke too quickly of dreams had become a man who could carry revelation with humility. The servant who once hoped for rescue through human favor had learned to depend fully on divine timing. The prisoner who had entered this place with unanswered questions was leaving it, though he did not yet know it, with a settled heart. Nothing more needed to be taken from him, and nothing essential was lacking. The prison had stripped Joseph of illusions. It had removed entitlement, impatience, and the need for recognition. What remained was obedience without condition, faith without visible reward, and a quiet strength that did not demand control. This was the work God had intended all along. The delay had not been neglect, it had been mercy, shaping a soul capable of standing before kings without losing reverence for God. As the night neared its end, Joseph stirred slightly and opened his eyes. The darkness looked no different, yet his heart was at rest. He did not sense freedom approaching, nor did he expect it. His trust was no longer tied to outcomes. Whether morning brought another ordinary day or an unexpected summons, Joseph was prepared to receive it with the same faithfulness that had carried him through years of silence. This was the final lesson of the night, that readiness is not anticipation, but surrender. Joseph was ready not because he foresaw change, but because he had learned to be faithful in stillness. The waiting had done its work. The shaping was complete. Soon the silence would break. Soon his name would be spoken beyond these walls. Soon the chains would fall away, not by force, but by divine command. But for now, the prison remained quiet, holding the last moments of a chapter written in darkness and patience. The night had fulfilled its purpose, and morning was approaching. Morning came to the prison as it always did, without ceremony and without mercy. Light slipped through narrow openings high above the stone walls, faint and reluctant, revealing nothing new, only confirming that another day had begun exactly as the last had ended. Joseph rose with the others, steady in his movements, unhurried, accustomed to a rhythm that no longer promised change. Yet within this sameness, God was quietly weaving threads that would later be recognized as purpose. It was during one of these ordinary mornings that the chief cupbearer and the chief baker were brought into the prison. Their arrival did not stir excitement among the other prisoners, but Joseph noticed them immediately. They carried themselves differently, marked by proximity to Pharaoh and by the sudden fall from favor that neither had anticipated. Power, Joseph had learned, leaves a trace even when stripped away, and fear does the same. Both men bore it on their faces. Joseph did not approach them with curiosity alone. He had learned to observe carefully, to read what was unspoken. Leadership in confinement required attentiveness more than authority, and compassion more than command. He served them not as a superior, but as one acquainted with loss. Over time, trust formed quietly, the kind of trust that grows not from shared ambition, but from shared vulnerability. Then came the dreams. One night, both men dreamed, and by morning, the weight of those dreams pressed heavily upon them.
Dreams in ancient times were not dismissed as imagination, they were feared as messages, especially when they disturbed the soul. Joseph noticed their downcast expressions and asked a simple question, one that revealed his character more than his position. He did not assume, he did not command, he asked. When they spoke of their dreams, Joseph listened without interruption. He did not rush to interpretation, nor did he pretend certainty. Only after hearing fully did he speak, grounding his confidence not in himself, but in God. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he said, acknowledging openly that revelation was not his possession, but God's gift.
Joseph interpreted the dreams truthfully. To the cupbearer, restoration. To the baker, judgment. He softened nothing and exaggerated nothing. Faithfulness, Joseph understood, is not measured by how pleasant one's words are, but by how accurately they reflect the will of God. Speaking truth carried risk, but Joseph had long since accepted that obedience was safer than self-protection. When Joseph finished, he allowed himself one human request. It was not grand, not demanding. It was spoken with restraint born of long endurance. He asked the cupbearer to remember him when freedom returned, to speak on his behalf, to acknowledge that an innocent man had been left behind. It was hope expressed quietly, cautiously, as though Joseph feared to believe in it too strongly. The days that followed passed slowly. Joseph watched as the interpretations unfolded exactly as spoken. The cupbearer was restored. The baker was executed. The precision of fulfillment affirmed that God had spoken, yet affirmation did not bring release. The door did not open. The prison remained. At first, Joseph waited with measured expectation, not impatience but attentiveness. Each passing day carried the possibility that his name would be spoken beyond the walls. Each sound in the corridor suggested change. But days became weeks, and weeks became months. The expected word never came. And then, silence settled in. Scripture records this moment simply. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Those few words carry the weight of years. Forgetting, in this sense, was not an active rejection, but a passive neglect. Life resumed. Favor returned, memory faded. Joseph remained where he was. This was a deeper test than imprisonment itself. To be confined is painful. To be forgotten after helping another is a quieter wound. It does not cry out, it lingers. Joseph felt it, but he did not allow it to harden him. The disappointment was real, yet it did not become bitterness. He had learned that unmet expectations could either corrode faith or refine it. 2 years passed. They were not marked by events, but by faithfulness. Joseph continued to serve, continued to lead within limits, continued to walk uprightly in a place that offered no reward for integrity. These years are almost invisible in the biblical record, yet they were essential. God was not delaying Joseph's deliverance, he was completing Joseph's preparation. Joseph's trust matured in this hidden season. He no longer looked for validation from fulfilled predictions or remembered favors. He placed his hope where memory could not fail. God had not forgotten him, even if people had. And in that assurance, Joseph learned to stand without leaning on outcomes. The prison did not change, but Joseph did. The passage of time in the prison could not be measured by calendars or seasons. There were no festivals, no harvests, no visible markers to distinguish one year from the next. Time was felt instead through routine, through repetition, through the quiet erosion of expectation. For Joseph, these years after the cupbearer's release were not defined by disappointment alone, but by a gradual surrender of the need to be remembered by others. At first, memory lingered. Joseph could recall clearly the look in the cupbearer's eyes when hope returned, the gratitude that had briefly connected them. That memory carried an unspoken question: why had nothing come of it? But as months stretched into years, Joseph no longer rehearsed the moment. He learned to let go of what could not be controlled. The forgetting of the cupbearer became a boundary, teaching Joseph where human faithfulness ends and divine faithfulness begins. In the silence that followed, Joseph discovered a new depth to prayer. His prayers grew simpler, stripped of urgency and explanation. He no longer pleaded for deliverance or demanded clarity. Instead, he prayed for endurance, for wisdom, for the grace to remain faithful in the unseen places. These prayers did not rise from desperation, but from alignment. Joseph was learning to want what God wanted, even when it required continued waiting.
God's silence was not absence. Joseph had come to understand that silence can be a form of speech, shaping the heart more powerfully than words. In the absence of direction, obedience became its own instruction. Each act of faithfulness, though unnoticed, became an offering. Joseph did not know who would one day read his story, but he lived as though every moment was seen by God. He observed the other prisoners closely during these years. Some grew bitter, others grew numb. A few clung to false hope, inventing explanations for delays that never ended. Joseph chose a different posture. He accepted the reality of his situation without surrendering his trust. This balance, honest acceptance without despair, became one of the defining marks of his maturity. Leadership continued to grow quietly within him. Joseph was entrusted with responsibility not because he sought it, but because he handled small things with care. Authority in prison was limited, yet it revealed character. Joseph learned how to guide without dominating, how to correct without humiliating, how to serve without resentment. These were lessons no palace could teach.
The delay also refined Joseph's understanding of justice. Earlier in his life, justice had meant being proven innocent and restored quickly. Now, justice took on a broader meaning. It meant trusting that God sees fully, even when human systems fail. It meant believing that righteousness is not wasted, even when it appears unrewarded. Joseph learned that God's justice moves on a timeline shaped by wisdom, not urgency. At times, Joseph reflected on the dreams that had begun his journey. He no longer tried to interpret their timing or shape their fulfillment. He held them lightly, without insistence. Dreams, he understood, were promises, not schedules. They pointed to God's intention, not to human expectation. The dreams remained true, but Joseph was no longer anxious about when or how they would come to pass. The forgetting of the cupbearer became a turning point, not because it delayed Joseph's freedom, but because it completed his detachment from human rescue. Joseph was no longer waiting for someone to speak on his behalf. He was waiting for God to act in his time. That shift changed everything. Waiting ceased to be a burden and became a posture of trust. Unseen by Joseph, the world beyond the prison was also moving. Pharaoh's court continued its rhythms of power and politics, unaware that the solution to a future crisis sat quietly behind stone walls. God was aligning moments that would converge suddenly and unmistakably. But until that convergence, Joseph remained exactly where he was meant to be. The years of silence were not empty. They were full of formation. By the time they ended, Joseph had become a man whose faith no longer depended on remembrance, reward, or release. He was prepared to stand in any place God assigned him, whether hidden or exalted. And then, without warning, the silence would break. But that moment belongs to what comes next.
As the second year drew to its quiet close, Joseph no longer marked time by hope or disappointment. The waiting had reached a point of completion where nothing more needed to be surrendered. He had learned to live faithfully without reference to release, to trust God without conditions attached. What once felt like delay now felt like design. Joseph's inner posture had shifted fully. He was no longer bracing himself for rescue, nor guarding against despair. He had become steady, rooted in a confidence that did not depend on visible progress. This steadiness was not resignation, it was readiness. God had not kept him in prison because Joseph was unworthy of freedom, but because freedom without formation would have been premature. The memory of the cupbearer had faded into the background, no longer a source of pain or expectation. Forgetting, once a wound, had become a lesson. Joseph understood now that human memory is fragile, but divine purpose is not. What people forget, God holds. What people overlook, God prepares. The prison had taught Joseph where true security lies. Scripture offers no dramatic scenes for these years, no dialogue, no events to capture attention, and that silence is intentional. God often works most deeply when there is nothing to report. The absence of narrative signals not inactivity, but completion. Joseph's character had been shaped sufficiently for what lay ahead. By the end of this season, Joseph had become a man who did not need to be seen in order to be whole. He could stand alone before God, uncelebrated and unnoticed, and still remain faithful. This was the strength that would soon place him before power without fear and before abundance without corruption. Beyond the prison walls, a tension was forming. Pharaoh, the most powerful man in Egypt, would soon be troubled by dreams he could not understand. None of his wise men would be able to offer insight. What appeared to be a sudden crisis would, in truth, be the convergence of long-prepared timing. The silence in Joseph's life was about to meet the unrest in Pharaoh's mind.
Joseph did not know this. He slept and woke as he always had, unaware that the God who had taught him patience was now preparing to move swiftly. The same God who had delayed deliverance was about to act with urgency. Joseph's waiting would soon give way to action, not because Joseph demanded it, but because the moment was right. The promise once spoken through dreams had not failed, it had been preserved. The forgetting of the cupbearer had not canceled it, it had protected it. When Joseph would finally be remembered, it would not be as a prisoner seeking release, but as a servant of God ready to speak truth to power. The season of being forgotten was ending. The silence was about to break, and what followed would change everything.
The silence did not break in the prison first. It broke in the palace. Pharaoh awoke from sleep unsettled, his rest disturbed by images that would not release him. The dreams lingered with an intensity that refused to fade with morning light. They were not vague impressions, but clear and troubling visions, marked by repetition and weight. Pharaoh had known dreams before, but these were different. They pressed upon his spirit, carrying the unmistakable sense that something beyond his control was being revealed. In the dream, Pharaoh stood by the Nile, the river that sustained Egypt's life and power. From its waters rose 7 cows, healthy and strong, feeding peacefully among the reeds. Then came 7 others, gaunt and ravaged, so thin they seemed scarcely alive. Without warning, the lean cows consumed the healthy ones, yet remained unchanged, as if nothing had satisfied them. Pharaoh awoke disturbed, only to fall asleep again and dream a second dream, one that mirrored the first. 7 full, good ears of grain grew on a single stalk, followed by 7 thin ears, scorched by the east wind.
The thin ears swallowed the good, and again Pharaoh awoke, shaken. Morning brought no relief. The dreams would not loosen their grip. Pharaoh summoned the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men trained in interpretation, guardians of tradition and knowledge. They listened carefully, but none could explain the meaning. Their silence was not thoughtful, it was helpless. For the first time, Pharaoh faced a mystery beyond the reach of power, ritual, and intellect. This was the moment God had prepared for. In the court's confusion, a memory stirred quietly, long delayed but precisely timed. The chief cupbearer, standing before Pharaoh, suddenly remembered. Not gradually, not partially, but fully. The image of a Hebrew prisoner once overlooked came sharply into focus. He recalled the dreams in the prison, the interpretations spoken with calm certainty, the exact fulfillment of every word. The forgetting that had lasted 2 years ended in a single instant. The cupbearer spoke hesitantly at first, then with urgency. He confessed his fault, acknowledging the one he had failed to remember. He spoke of Joseph, of his gift, and of the God who revealed meanings hidden from human wisdom. Pharaoh listened. A prisoner's name, long buried in silence, crossed the threshold of power. In the prison, Joseph knew nothing of this. He rose as he always did, unaware that the world beyond his walls had shifted. He did not sense release approaching. His faith had learned not to anticipate change. That discipline would now be tested in a different way. When the summons came, it was sudden and unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, hurried and purposeful, cut through the familiar stillness. Joseph was called by name, not tomorrow, not soon, now. The transition was abrupt. One moment he was a prisoner, the next he was being prepared to stand before the ruler of Egypt. He was washed, clothed, and brought out of confinement. The years of waiting gave way to moments of movement. God, who had taken time to prepare Joseph, now acted without delay. As Joseph was led from the darkness toward light, there was no confusion in his heart. Fear did not overtake him. The prison had done its work. He did not rush ahead of God with words or expectations. He walked forward with steadiness, carrying within him the quiet strength formed in silence. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, he did not claim authority or insight as his own. He spoke plainly, humbly, and without hesitation. "It is not in me," he said. "God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." This was the fruit of long preparation. The man who once spoke freely of his dreams now spoke carefully, directing all attention toward God. Joseph listened to Pharaoh recount the dreams, recognizing them immediately. Yet recognition did not lead to haste. He waited, attentive and composed, until the moment to speak arrived. The interpretation he would soon offer was not merely insight, it was instruction, warning, and provision combined. This was no longer the season of silence, but neither was it yet the season of elevation. Between revelation and exaltation stood obedience in the moment. Joseph was ready. Joseph listened as Pharaoh spoke, his posture attentive, his expression steady. The dreams were described carefully, almost reverently, as though Pharaoh himself sensed their gravity. Joseph did not interrupt. He did not rush ahead with interpretation. Years of waiting had taught him that discernment requires patience, and that wisdom is best offered only after listening fully. When Pharaoh finished, the court fell silent. The weight of expectation rested on Joseph alone. Yet Joseph did not feel the pressure of performance. He felt only the responsibility of faithfulness. He understood that this moment was not about proving his ability, but about honoring the God who reveals what is hidden. Joseph spoke calmly, without embellishment. He explained that the 2 dreams were one, repeated to show certainty and nearness of fulfillment. 7 years of abundance would come upon Egypt, followed by 7 years of severe famine. The famine would be so consuming that the abundance would be forgotten, just as the healthy cows were consumed by the lean. The dreams were not meant to frighten Pharaoh, but to prepare him. Joseph did not stop at interpretation. He offered counsel, not as an act of ambition, but as an act of stewardship. He advised Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee the land, to collect and store grain during the years of plenty, and to prepare for the coming scarcity. This counsel was not self-serving. Joseph did not suggest himself. He spoke only of what must be done. The court listened. Pharaoh listened.
What unfolded next was not merely a political decision, but a divine turning point. Pharaoh recognized something his wise men had missed. The interpretation carried not only clarity, but authority. It bore the mark of truth. Pharaoh discerned that the Spirit of God rested upon Joseph, and that wisdom beyond human origin had been revealed. Without delay, Pharaoh acted. He did not consult further advisors. He did not postpone the decision. He spoke decisively, elevating Joseph from prisoner to governor in a single declaration. Authority was transferred not gradually, but completely. The chains were replaced with a signet ring. The garments of confinement gave way to garments of honor. The man who had been forgotten was now entrusted with the future of a nation. Joseph did not resist the suddenness of change. He did not grasp at power. He received responsibility with humility. The transition did not disorient him because his identity had already been formed in obscurity. He knew who he was before he knew where he would stand. The crowd in the court witnessed a reversal beyond explanation. But Joseph understood that this moment was not accidental. The waiting had not been wasted. The silence had not been abandonment. Every delay had been preparation for this precise intersection of readiness and necessity. Joseph was now positioned to act. The dreams that once led him into exile had brought him into purpose. Yet even now he did not celebrate. He listened. He accepted the task. He began to prepare, fully aware that elevation was not the end of obedience, but its expansion. The prison was behind him. The work was ahead. The transformation was swift, yet it did not overwhelm Joseph. As authority settled upon him, he did not lose the composure formed in years of obscurity. The sudden shift from confinement to command might have disoriented another man, but Joseph had already learned how to stand without reliance on circumstance. Elevation did not change him, it revealed him.
Pharaoh's command was clear and absolute. Joseph was placed over all the land of Egypt, second only to the throne itself. With this authority came responsibility unlike anything Joseph had known. The same man who once managed prisoners was now entrusted with a nation's survival. Yet the scale of the task did not intimidate him. God had enlarged his capacity long before he enlarged his position. Joseph moved quickly, not out of fear, but out of obedience. He traveled throughout Egypt, assessing the land, organizing storage, appointing overseers, and establishing order. The years of plenty began, and under Joseph's leadership, abundance was not consumed recklessly, but gathered with wisdom. Every storehouse filled became a testament that God's warnings are acts of mercy and that preparation is an expression of faith. Throughout this season, Joseph remained anchored. Power did not dull his dependence on God. Success did not erase his memory of the prison. The lessons of waiting stayed with him, guarding his heart against pride. He understood that authority is a trust, not a possession, and that leadership exists to preserve life, not to exalt self. The silence that had defined Joseph's earlier years had given way to activity, yet his inner posture remained unchanged. He continued to listen before acting, to seek God's wisdom rather than rely on his own understanding. The same God who had spoken through dreams continued to guide him through discernment.
As the years of abundance unfolded exactly as foretold, Joseph saw confirmation not of his ability, but of God's faithfulness. Every fulfilled detail reinforced the truth that God's word does not return empty. The dreams that once isolated him had become the means by which countless lives would be preserved. The famine would soon come. The preparation was in place. The stage was set for a reunion Joseph had not anticipated, and for a test far greater than imprisonment or authority. The chapter of silence had ended. The chapter of responsibility had begun, and the story was far from over. The years of abundance passed, and just as God had spoken, the years of famine came. The land of Egypt, once overflowing, now felt the tightening grip of scarcity. Fields that had yielded generously stood bare, and the certainty of hunger spread beyond borders. Yet within Egypt there was food. What had been gathered in obedience now became the means of survival, not only for a nation, but for many. Joseph stood at the center of this provision. Day after day, people came to him, desperate and uncertain, and he answered not with impatience, but with order. The famine revealed much about human nature, but it also revealed the fruit of faithful preparation. The wisdom God had given Joseph was no longer abstract, it was saving lives.
News of Egypt's storehouses reached distant lands, including Canaan. Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt and sent his sons to buy food. He kept Benjamin back, guarding the last living reminder of Rachel with fear shaped by loss. The brothers set out, unaware that the journey would confront them with the past they had buried but never escaped. When the sons of Jacob entered Egypt, they came before the governor of the land. They bowed low, following custom, not recognizing the man before them. Joseph recognized them immediately. Time had changed their faces, but not beyond memory. In an instant, the dreams of his youth returned, not as triumph, but as truth fulfilled. Yet Joseph did not reveal himself. Recognition did not lead to reunion, it led to discernment. Joseph spoke to them harshly, not out of cruelty, but out of purpose. He accused them of being spies, questioned their integrity, and observed their responses carefully. This was not revenge, it was examination. Joseph was not testing their fear, but their hearts. Time had passed, but had guilt been transformed into repentance? As the brothers defended themselves, fragments of truth emerged. They spoke of their father, of a younger brother left behind, of one brother who was no more. Each word carried weight. Joseph listened in silence, absorbing every detail. The mention of Benjamin stirred something deep within him, yet he restrained himself. Emotion would not lead this moment. Wisdom would.
Joseph placed them in custody briefly, allowing fear to surface. In that confined space, conscience awakened. They spoke among themselves, believing they were unheard, confessing guilt for what they had done to their brother years before. Joseph understood every word. Their remorse was not forced, it was remembered. He turned away to weep, unseen, allowing compassion to rise without surrendering clarity. Joseph released them with conditions. Simeon would remain behind. The others would return with grain, but they must bring Benjamin back. This demand was not arbitrary. It was the final test. Joseph needed to know whether they would protect the son of Rachel now or sacrifice him again for their own survival. As the brothers departed, confusion and fear accompanied them. They did not know why this man held such power or why his demands cut so deeply. Joseph watched them leave, carrying not only grain, but the weight of unresolved truth. The famine continued, and the test had begun. The journey back to Canaan was heavy with unspoken fear.
Though their sacks were filled with grain, the brothers carried something far heavier within them. Every mile away from Egypt pressed their conscience more firmly against memory. The past they had avoided for years now walked beside them, silently upon them. Benjamin must go. At the sound of that name, Jacob's heart recoiled. The wound he had carried since Joseph's disappearance reopened. Loss had taught him caution, and caution had hardened into refusal. Time passed, and the famine deepened. Grain diminished, hunger returned. The question they had postponed could no longer be avoided. Jacob resisted until necessity forced the decision. It was Judah who stepped forward, not the youngest, not the favored, but the one whose past held its own weight of failure. Judah offered himself as surety for Benjamin, binding his life to the safety of his brother. This was no small promise. It was transformation spoken aloud.
Jacob, worn by time and circumstance, consented. He entrusted Benjamin to his sons and to God. He sent gifts and double money, uncertain of the outcome but aware that survival required risk. As they departed once more, fear accompanied them, but so did resolve. When they returned to Egypt and stood again before Joseph, the moment was charged with tension. Joseph saw Benjamin. The sight of his younger brother, grown and whole, nearly undid him. Years of restraint were tested in a single instant. Yet Joseph held his composure. Emotion, once more, was acknowledged, but not allowed to rule. Joseph extended hospitality instead of accusation. The brothers were brought into his house. They feared judgment, suspecting deception, but were met with kindness. Simeon was released. Food was prepared. Order was restored. Still, Joseph observed. The test was not complete. Joseph arranged one final trial. His silver cup was placed in Benjamin's sack. The brothers were allowed to depart, only to be overtaken and accused of theft. When the cup was discovered, despair returned. They were brought back not as strangers, but as men facing consequence.
Judah stepped forward. He did not deny responsibility. He did not bargain for escape. He spoke of his father's grief, of the cost of loss, and of the promise he had made. Then he offered himself in place of Benjamin. This was the turning point. What had once been selfishness had become sacrifice. What had once been betrayal had become protection. Joseph could bear no more. The test had revealed what Joseph needed to know. The brothers had changed. Guilt had given way to repentance. Love had replaced envy. The moment of concealment was ending. Joseph could no longer restrain himself. The careful distance he had maintained, the measured testing, the restraint shaped by years of discipline, all gave way before the sight of genuine repentance. The moment Judah offered himself in Benjamin's place, the final barrier fell. This was not the obedience of fear, but the love of sacrifice. The past had been confronted, and it had not remained unchanged. Joseph ordered everyone else to leave the room. Servants, officials, guards, all were dismissed. What was about to happen did not belong to power or politics. It belonged to family, to truth, and to grace. When the room was cleared, Joseph wept aloud. His weeping was not quiet or controlled. It was the sound of years released, of pain carried in silence, finally allowed to breathe.
"I am Joseph," he said. The words fell like thunder. His brothers stood frozen, their minds unable to reconcile the governor of Egypt with the brother they had betrayed. Fear overwhelmed them. The past rose up in full force, threatening judgment and retribution. They could not speak. They could not move. Joseph drew them closer. His voice softened. He spoke not as ruler, but as brother. He told them not to be distressed, not to be angry with themselves. He spoke of God's purpose, of preservation, of life saved through suffering.
He did not minimize their sin, but he reframed its meaning. What they intended for harm, God had used for good. Joseph embraced Benjamin. He wept again. Then he embraced each of his brothers in turn. Forgiveness was not offered lightly, but fully. It flowed not from denial, but from understanding shaped by years of waiting and trust. Joseph's authority now served reconciliation, not revenge. The brothers left the room changed. They carried not only grain and favor, but restoration. The famine still raged outside, but something far deeper had been healed within.
Joseph sent word to his father. The news was unbelievable. Joseph was alive. He ruled in Egypt. Jacob's spirit revived. Hope returned where grief had lived for decades. The family would be reunited, not as it once was, but as it had been reshaped through suffering and grace. The test of the heart had been passed. The time of concealment had ended. What remained was the work of reconciliation and provision. The news reached Jacob like a breath returning to lungs long accustomed to grief. Joseph was alive. The words themselves felt impossible, too heavy with hope to be trusted at once. For years, Jacob had learned how to live with absence, how to carry loss without collapse. Hope had become dangerous. And yet, as his sons spoke, as details unfolded, something within him stirred. Not certainty at first, but awakening. When Jacob saw the wagons sent by Pharaoh, when he heard of Joseph's authority and provision, his spirit revived. The God who had seemed silent for so long had not been absent. What Jacob believed to be an ending had been a long unfolding. He set out for Egypt, carrying not only his household, but a heart slowly reopening to trust. God met Jacob on the journey. In the quiet of night, reassurance came. Egypt would not be a grave, but a place of preservation. The promise given to Abraham would not fail there. Jacob went forward, not without fear, but with obedience shaped by faith renewed. When Joseph went out to meet his father, the moment dissolved years of separation. Authority, position, and power fell away as Joseph embraced Jacob. They wept together, father and son, bound again by life restored. Jacob spoke the words he never believed he would say. He could now die in peace, having seen his son alive. Joseph settled his family in Goshen, a place of provision and separation where they could grow without losing identity. He ensured their safety not as favoritism, but as stewardship. Through Joseph's wisdom, Egypt survived the famine, and through Egypt many nations were sustained. Power was exercised not for domination, but for preservation. Jacob stood before Pharaoh, blessing him, a quiet reminder that the promises of God did not depend on political strength. The old shepherd blessed the ruler of the greatest empire of the time, not because Jacob was powerful, but because God's covenant flowed through him.
As the years passed, the family grew. What had once been a fractured household became a multiplying people. Pain had not been erased, but it had been redeemed. Memory no longer ruled them with fear. Forgiveness had altered the future. Joseph continued to serve faithfully, guiding Egypt through the famine's end and its aftermath. Yet his heart remained anchored not in success, but in calling. He knew that his life was part of something larger than personal restoration. God had been shaping a people, not just a story. The silence that once marked Joseph's youth had become wisdom. The suffering that had once seemed unjust had become a bridge to salvation for many. What was broken had been healed, not by forgetting, but by trusting God's hand through every season. And still, the story was not finished. As the years unfolded in Goshen, life found a new rhythm. The famine eventually loosened its grip, but the lessons it had carved remained. Jacob lived the remainder of his days not in fear of loss, but in awareness of grace. Time softened his sorrow, and memory no longer accused God of silence. Instead, it testified to faithfulness, delayed but never denied. Joseph watched his father age. Each passing season carried quiet weight. He had learned how fragile time truly was, how swiftly years could be taken or returned. Authority had not dulled his tenderness. Power had not distanced him from humility. He remained a son before he was a ruler, a servant before he was a governor.
Jacob gathered his sons as his strength waned. What he spoke over them was more than farewell. It was inheritance. Blessings were given not according to preference, but according to truth. Past failures were acknowledged. Future destinies were spoken. When Jacob placed his hands upon Joseph's sons, crossing them intentionally, Joseph was reminded once again that God's ways do not follow human expectation. The younger received precedence. Grace, not order, governed God's design. Joseph did not correct his father. He had learned when to act and when to yield. The God who had guided him through betrayal and imprisonment did not require intervention. He required trust. Joseph understood now that discernment often meant restraint. When Jacob died, grief returned, but it did not destroy. Joseph wept, not as a man undone, but as one who understood the sacredness of mourning. He honored his father, carrying his body back to the land of promise. Egypt mourned with him, not out of obligation, but respect. Joseph's life had shaped not only his family, but an entire nation. After the burial, fear resurfaced among the brothers. With their father gone, they wondered if forgiveness would remain. The old patterns threatened to return. They sent word to Joseph, pleading for mercy. The past still whispered, even after reconciliation.
Joseph's response revealed the fullness of his transformation. He wept again, not in anger, but in sorrow that fear still lingered. He spoke words that would define his legacy. He was not in the place of God. What they had meant for evil, God had meant for good, to preserve many lives. Forgiveness was not conditional, it was complete. Joseph reassured them. He provided for them. He chose peace over power. In doing so, he sealed the work God had begun long before, in a pit, in a prison, in a season of waiting. Joseph lived to see generations rise. His faith did not diminish with age. As his own life neared its end, his vision extended beyond Egypt. He spoke of God's promise to bring Israel out of that land. He asked that his bones not remain there. Even in death, Joseph looked forward. The famine had shaped him. The prison had refined him. Forgiveness had freed him. Yet one final chapter remained. As Joseph's days lengthened toward their close, his life no longer moved with urgency, but with clarity. He had done what he was called to do. He had served with integrity, forgiven without reserve, and trusted God beyond what circumstance ever allowed him to see. The noise of power faded, leaving behind the quiet weight of faith proven true. Joseph gathered his family and spoke not of Egypt's glory, but of God's promise. He reminded them that their future did not belong to the land that had sustained them, but to the covenant that preceded them. Egypt had been a shelter, not a destination. Comfort was not their inheritance. Promise was.
He spoke of a time when God would surely come to their aid, when he would lead them out of Egypt and back to the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. These words were not speculation, they were conviction. Joseph had lived long enough to know that God's timing unfolds beyond a single lifetime, yet never without purpose. Joseph's final request was simple and profound. He asked that his bones not remain in Egypt. This was not sentimentality, it was testimony. Even in death, Joseph aligned himself with what God would do, not merely with what God had already done. His body would wait for fulfillment, just as his life once had. When Joseph died, Egypt mourned him. The nation honored the man through whom it had survived its darkest years. Yet among his people, his death carried a different weight. They did not lose a ruler, they gained a witness. His life became a reminder that God is faithful through generations, not only moments. The family of Israel remained in Goshen, growing quietly, steadily, unaware of the trials that would one day rise against them. But the foundation had been laid. Faith had been planted not merely in words, but in lived experience. The God who had turned betrayal into blessing would remain with them. Joseph's story did not end with him. It passed into memory, into identity, into hope carried forward. The pit, the prison, the palace, all had served a single purpose: to reveal a God who works in silence, waits patiently, and redeems completely. The healing was finished. The legacy was secured. All that remained was fulfillment yet to come.
Joseph's life, when seen from its end, no longer appeared as a series of disconnected events, but as a single movement guided by a faithful hand. The pit had not been a mistake. The prison had not been abandonment. The palace had not been reward. Each season had served a purpose greater than comfort, greater than understanding, and greater than Joseph himself. What defined Joseph was not his rise, but his restraint. He learned to wait when he could have despaired, to listen when he could have spoken, and to forgive when he could have ruled by fear. Silence shaped him before authority revealed him. The years unseen prepared him for the years remembered. Joseph never demanded answers from God. He did not ask why betrayal was allowed or why justice was delayed. Instead, he learned who God was in the waiting. Faith for Joseph was not certainty about outcomes, but trust in character. This trust sustained him when dreams seemed forgotten and promises appeared broken. The greatest miracle in Joseph's story was not survival or success, it was transformation. The boy who once spoke dreams without wisdom became a man who carried revelation with humility. The brother who was sold became the brother who saved. Forgiveness did not erase the past, it redeemed it.
Through Joseph, God demonstrated that suffering can be a passage, not a punishment. That delay can be preparation. That silence can be instruction. What appears hidden is often being formed. What seems lost may be preserved for a greater purpose. Joseph's bones waited centuries before being carried out of Egypt. Even in death, he remained aligned with God's promise. This quiet waiting testified that faith does not end with fulfillment seen, but with hope entrusted to God beyond one's lifetime. The people of Israel would one day walk out of Egypt, carrying with them the bones of a man who believed before he ever saw. His story would travel with them, reminding each generation that God remembers, God provides, and God redeems. Joseph's life leaves a final truth. God is present in the long night, active in unseen places, and faithful beyond what the human heart can measure. Silence is not absence. Waiting is not loss. And what God begins, He completes. The story ends not with Joseph, but with God still working. And that is where faith continues.